So it's a great honor and privilege to be introducing Professor Subramaniam from Madras Institute of Development Studies. Sanjay was absolutely right when he began his remarks. He said that it was really a kind of concession because of the time for him to be speaking about these matters, because in some sense both he certainly and I have learned very much. In fact, a lot of what we know about poverty, as have many of you from Professor Subramaniam's work. He's an expert on issues of collective choice, on distributive justice, and poverty measurement specifically, and he has in fact written a book, many interesting papers, but recently a book on the subject as well. Just another point of interest, Vamsi and I have, and of course along with Shripad, have only ever written one paper together, and that's a paper on wealth inequality. Well, two papers together, that's right, but the broad issue is on wealth inequality, and the only paper that we could use as a model was in fact a paper that was written by Professor Subramaniam. So in some sense this is not just a pleasure, but also a way of thanking him for being kind of beacon for us when we were doing some of our work. So please join me in welcoming Professor Subramaniam.
Thank you very much indeed. I hope you can hear me. Very much for his introductory remarks. I've learned a few things about myself which I didn't even suspect, but thanks very much. I assure you I'm not complaining. Okay. Right, so now what I'm going to do is get on with the job. Let me first ask you, how much of what Sanjay said did you understand? All of it? Some of it? A good deal of it? About a half. So are you speaking for everybody? I mean, is that a safe presumption to make? Okay, the reason I ask is that he had a particularly difficult job to perform, which is that he had time which was very rationed. I put this in my pocket. Okay, thank you. I can already see that it makes a difference. Okay. You see, he had very little time at his disposal. So what he could do was only to speak about certain general underlying principles of the subject that he was dealing with. He was therefore obliged also, therefore, to pitch his talk at a certain level of abstraction without having the luxury of actually giving content to the general propositions that he was making in terms of concrete examples on the ground. So what I hope to be able to do, although I cannot speak for Sanjay and I cannot answer for him, but I do know, as he said, that independently we have worked on several issues of which share a great deal in common with each other, and we have independently arrived at very many of the same conclusions. And not the least reason for this is that there is one paper in particular going back to 1983, a paper by Amartya Sen called Poor Relatively Speaking, in which he has already anticipated all these issues. There already is a response, as it were, in advance to some of the questions which have been raised subsequently. And I think it's a pity that he has not revisited that issue. Okay? So much of what one has to say is derivative and contingent upon Sen's earlier insights into the issue of identification, which is simply a procedure whereby in income space or in money metric space, you identify a level such that those who are below it are identified as being poor. Okay. Now, let me start out by saying that all of the discussion which we're going to have today, which has already happened with Sanjay starting out, has been on what you might call unidimensional, specifically money metric poverty. Okay. Now, there is a great case for studying deprivation as a multidimensional concept. Now, it is not as if multidimensional poverty measurement is devoid of ambiguities and difficulties. that also is an enterprise which is beset by a great many difficulties. But I think it's important for us to recognize that we are not really talking about multidimensional poverty here. We are speaking specifically about unidimensional money metric poverty. I say this simply so that we have an idea of what we are going to be talking about and what we are not going to be talking about. It has nothing to do with the prioritization of the relative importance of these two ways of looking at the problem. Okay? Nutritional adequacy as a basis in which to anchor the poverty line. So under the cost of basic needs approach, typically what one would do is to find the least cost, as Sanjay was saying, of an appropriately prescribed diet which is supposed to capture the tastes of a typically poor segment of the population. Okay? And then we use this as what you might call a food poverty line, and then to employ the food poverty line as a basis for constructing an aggregate poverty line, which will also reckon non-food requirements. You'll see that we are already starting out with something of a contradiction, the circularity of logic. Because under the cost of basic needs approach, what you need is to cost the diet of a typically poor segment of the population. Okay. And it is that poverty line which you discover, which is then supposed to enable you to identify the poor segment of the population. Okay, so you already see that the elements of the circularity which are involved here, but let's leave that out of the reckoning for the time being. Let's just assume that this is a valid way in which you can proceed. Now, I just brought it up in order not to have to deal with it again. Because in India, in the US, which is very much at the basis of the poverty thresholds, which were advanced sometime in the early and mid-1960s, thanks to the pioneering efforts of, let's say, 2,400 kilocalories per person per day, as being required by an average Indian after taking account of their occupation, their gender, their age, and so on and so forth. So you specify, let's say it's possible to specify some such norm. Now, what you can also do is, typically, if you were to plot income or consumption expenditure, which is generally regarded as being a more reliable money metric indicator of welfare, because consumption typically tends to be smoothed out, unlike income, which is subject to more variability. If you were to call consumption expenditure X, and if you were to plot calorific consumption, okay, then as you might expect, as your level of consumption expenditure or income increases, your calorie consumption would also tend to increase, so you would probably get a curve which goes like that. Okay? All right. Now, before I proceed with this, let me say that, broadly speaking, when we are talking about poverty measurement, there are two exercises to this activity. In order to come up with one real number, which is supposed to tell you how much poverty there is in the regime that you're dealing with. That exercise is called aggregation, because you're aggregating information on the poverty line and on the distribution of incomes in order to seek a real valued representation for the extent of poverty that exists in the situation that you're confronted by. So, to repeat, you have a two-part problem. You begin with identification and then you go on to aggregation. Now, much of what you might call the jazzy work in poverty measurement has had to deal with aggregation, okay? Because that's what presents you with a great many opportunities for just dealing with pure math. So quite often you will find papers in the measurement of poverty to be fairly indistinguishable from tracts in real analysis. You know? So, but we're not going to deal with the aggregation problem at all today, except in terms of one very simple elementary index of poverty, which is called the headcount ratio. Okay, which will simply be defined as taking account of the number of people below the poverty line and expressing that count as a proportion of the total population. So the headcount ratio is simply the proportion of poor people in a society. So that's the only real valued measure of poverty that I'm going to be using. Okay? And for my purposes, that's all I need to deal with. So if there are Q poor people in a society of n individuals, Q divided by n is the headcount ratio. And this is the only index of poverty that I'll be using. Okay. It's good to have that out of the way because that's all I'm going to say about aggregation. The rest of this lecture will be devoted entirely to the identification problem. Okay. Now, I have to make the digression in the middle of a small discussion on the food energy intake method of identification, which essentially consists in plotting the relationship between calorific consumption and consumption expenditure or income, as the case might be. And you would typically expect an upward sloping curve, which simply suggests that as your level of income increases, you tend to consume more calories. Okay. Now, supposing you specify a certain norm, let's say 2,400 kilocalories, let me call that C star. Okay. This is what you need in order to avoid undernutrition, let's say. And let's for the moment concede that judgment is a reasonable one to make. But here you already have an example of some underlying judgment that you're making about the plausibility of the poverty line or the basis of the poverty line that you are advancing, as Sanjay pointed out. Okay, then from this graph, which you have probably generated through regression analysis, it becomes very easy for you to simply read off the corresponding level of consumption expenditure. We call it X star. Okay. So what this tells you is that the level of consumption expenditure at which the calorific norm is realized in this society, in this community, is X star. And what the food energy intake method dictates is that you treat X star as the poverty line in income space. Okay. Now you see several notions tend to get wrongly entangled with each other simply because of the inappropriate use of language. Often this is understood to mean that X star is the amount of money that is required in order to have command over a calorific norm of 2,400 kilocalories. This is not a statement really about a requirement. This is what you have actually observed to have happened. In this particular society, it so happens that at this particular point of time, a consumption expenditure level of X star is associated with consumption of this amount of calories. Now, it's conceivable, I suppose, that in a community which consists predominantly of people who are spending their money on alcohol and tobacco, you'll probably require, this correspondence will probably happen at a much higher level of income. Okay. Which is why it becomes somewhat problematic to see the food energy intake method as being a normative procedure for the postulation of a poverty line. So let's be clear about one thing. The specification of a poverty line is in the end a normative exercise. All right? Now, Sanjay may not have gone so far as to say exactly what I did now, but there was plenty in what he suggested to say that it's impossible to dissociate evaluative judgments, in other words, normative or ought-related propositions from the specification of a poverty line. Okay. However, a method such as this, as you will see, is an entirely empirical one. It's completely inductive. Okay. It says that what ought to be is in fact what is. All right? It's useful to keep that at the back of one's mind. Okay? But this is substantially the way in which the poverty line in India was fixed. You have a body of data which is generated now once every 5 years by the National Sample Survey Office of the Central Statistical Organization. It is a publication called it's called Consumption I forget what it's called. Survey on Consumption Expenditure with Notes thereof, something like that. So what you have is, for every state of the Indian Union, you have information on the actual distribution of consumption expenditure across consumption expenditure size classes. And you also have a detailed breakdown in terms of both the quantity and the commodities of which enter these consumption bundles. Okay. So for each size class of consumption expenditure, you have a detailed specification of how much of various food and non-food commodities are consumed, what is the unit value of these, and therefore what the total value of these various commodities is that is consumed. Okay. Now, if you have those data, then by using certain conversion factors for the food items, it's possible for you to realize their calorific value. So effectively, the National Sample Survey data equipped the policymaker with the ability to generate data on the distribution of consumption expenditure according to consumption expenditure classes, and also on the distribution of calories according to consumption expenditure classes. So you had this bivariate distribution which was available. On the basis of that, of those two sets of data, you could generate a curve of this nature and specify the poverty line as that level of consumption expenditure which was observed to be expended in order to achieve a calorific norm of 2,400 kilocalories per person per day in the rural areas and 2,100 kilocalories per person per day in the urban areas. You had a lower calorific requirement for the urban areas on the alleged grounds that typically activity status or work was less manual in the urban areas than in the rural ones, and therefore that it required less calories. Now, on the basis of a graph of this nature, the Planning Commission came up with the following poverty lines for rural and urban India with a certain breathtaking precision of 49 rupees and 9 paise, okay, in the rural areas, and of 56 rupees and 56 paise in the urban areas. So these are the rural and urban poverty lines. And it's important to recognize that these poverty lines have held sway for a long, long period of time. Our entire time series analysis of poverty going back from the late 1950s up until the present time in several assessments of poverty in India, both official and unofficial, have been based precisely on these poverty lines. So once you got these poverty lines, okay, at 73, 74 prices, what the Planning Commission went on to tell us was that if you wanted to get the poverty line in say 1977, 78, all you had to do was to update this poverty line by employing an appropriate price index, which for rural areas turned out to be the consumer price index of agricultural laborers. And in the urban areas, you employed some mix of a consumer price index of industrial workers and a consumer price index of non-manual workers. So all you had to really do in order to obtain the poverty lines at current prices was to update these by employing an appropriate price deflator. Okay. Now, let me expand the meaning of this a little bit so that you're not left in any doubt at all about what is actually happening. When you have estimated this as the poverty line, 49 rupees 9 paisa, as the poverty line at 1973-74 prices, you also know the commodity composition of these 49 rupees and 9 paisa. Okay, you know exactly, because you have these data in the National Sample Survey, how you assemble these various commodities in order to arrive at 49 rupees and 9 paisa. You have so much of milk, so much of eggs, so much of rice, so much of fish, so much of meat, so much of these various food items, then so much for rental, so much for footwear, so much on health, etc. Okay, so you have a complete breakdown of the 49 rupees and 9 paisa in terms of the quantities, the physical quantities of the various commodities which go into that poverty line. So all you really need to do, according to this method, at some subsequent point of time, is to revalue exactly those quantities of that commodity bundle at currently ruling prices. Okay. Now you may have recalled Sanjay telling you that for poverty assessments to be meaningful across space and over time, these assessments must be comparable one with the other, right? Which requires that your exercise of measurement must be mediated by some appropriate invariance of the standard of measurement in some appropriate space. What does that mean? I mean, it means something very simple. Supposing I'm measuring the length of this table, okay? And let's say this is a foot rule. I call this a foot rule, okay? And this turns out to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, roughly 9, okay? Turns out to be roughly 9 of whatever this is, okay? Let me call this, what is this? Oh, let me call this 1 remote, okay? So this is a unit which I call 1 remote. So this thing measures 9 remotes. Now supposing I want to measure this side of the table, it would make very little sense for me to call 1 remote something which is 1/2 of this, right? The standard which I employ to measure this side as well as this side must remain the same. So if 1 remote is what constitutes this length, then 1 remote is what must constitute this length also for purposes of my assessment to be comparable across contexts. You have exactly an analogous problem when you're measuring poverty or any other phenomenon that you can think of. Okay. What is being kept invariant out here? The length of the measuring rod, which I call 1 remote. Okay. So you need a similar invariance in the norm that you employ in order to measure poverty. The standard in terms of which you measure poverty, the remote, that standard must remain invariant across contexts. Okay. But you see, unlike in the case of length, which is arguably somewhat less problematic, the notion of poverty is slightly more philosophically complex, because it's not so immediately apparent to one as to which is the appropriate space in which you must seek this invariance of the poverty standard. What, not just implicitly, but explicitly, the expert group in 1993 said was that in order that you might be able to compare poverty systematically and consistently across regimes, which could be both cross-section comparisons and time series comparisons, you needed to fix the poverty norm in terms of the commodity bundle. Okay. And they said that if you're going to be changing the commodity bundle over time or across space, then you're not measuring the same thing any longer. And therefore you're guilty of violating a certain perceived required invariance in the space of commodity bundles. So this invariance was postulated as being a requirement in which space? In the space of commodity bundles. So ultimately all you had to concern yourself with was the following. For the same commodity bundle, you simply revalued it at currently rolling prices. Okay? So that's all you needed to do in order to secure what was believed to be the required invariance in the standard of poverty, in the poverty norm. All right? Now what does the World Bank do? The World Bank takes as its poverty line some level of real income. Now when I say real income, I mean income which has been corrected for price variations.
So there is a clarification.
Yes, sorry.
When you're saying you need to revalue the same bundle, how are we going to do that? Are we supposed to use the unit values on the NSS data?
That's one way in which you could do it. Now think of this problem not as a practical one, but as a purely conceptual one. So that's one way in which you can do it. Just use the unit values from the NSS data. Okay. But for the moment, just tell yourself that these items of information are available. Okay. The price or the unit value, okay, is available. So all you need to do is to multiply those fixed quantities by these variable prices in order to arrive at the totals at different points of time. Okay. So let's just deal with the problem at a conceptual level now, without getting into the question of, in fact, as it happens, this is not what the official agencies, nor indeed the independent scholars do. They use a price index. Okay, that's what they do. But they're using a price index as a surrogate for this conceptual activity, which consists simply of preserving the original commodity bundle on the grounds that it is only a unique commodity bundle which will permit meaningful comparison of poverty regimes across, of poverty assessments across regimes. And then you simply revalue these commodity bundles at currently ruling prices. Okay. What the World Bank does is to use a certain level of real income. By real income, I simply mean income which has been corrected for price variations. Okay, that's all it means. So it uses a real income of $1 per day. Okay, one purchasing power parity dollar per day. Take the US dollar as the norm, and you treat that as a numerator, and then you get the other. You can derive the value of that $1 in terms of other currencies for some appropriately specified basket of commodities. Okay. So what does the World Bank require? It says that for poverty comparisons to be meaningful, the poverty norm must be the same in terms of real income across comparison regimes. Okay. The Planning Commission says that the kind of invariance you require is in the space of commodities. The World Bank says the kind of invariance you require is in the space of real incomes. Now, these are specific examples, commodity bundles, real incomes, of what Sen more generally calls resources. Okay. So, most standard methods of poverty assessment rely on postulating that comparability is secured only if there is some invariance in the space of resources across comparison regimes. Okay? And these could be invariance of the commodity bundle or invariance of the real income. These are two concrete examples that we have. Okay? The American experience is something which I won't go into. It also entails a certain amount of relativity which rather clears the pitch comprehensively for any meaningful interpretation that you can confer on the US federal government's poverty lens. But I won't get into that. Let's just stick with this absolute view of poverty. Okay. Now, when you're dealing with resources, then effectively what you're asking for is to preserve the real value of the poverty line. That is the only thing you really need to worry about at the end of the day, is to correct these poverty lines for changes in prices. All right? That's all you really need. Now, why should that be a problem? If it is a problem at all. Take the Indian case. What is it that you actually do? In 1973-74, you found out what was the level of consumption expenditure which corresponded to a certain calorific norm. In other words, in deriving your poverty line, you depended entirely on the actual pattern of consumer behavior which obtained in that particular year. It depended entirely on the preferences which the typical representative consumer exhibited. It depended on the prices which that consumer was confronted with, and on the incomes of the consumer. Okay. You remember your standard budget line diagram, right? What is a consumer supposed to do? She or he is supposed to maximize their utility, subject to the constraint of prices and income. Okay? And I'm sure, if you're woken up out of your sleep, this is Econ 101, you will say that the solution to this problem lies at the point of tangency of the indifference curve to the budget constraint. Right? Now, what you're doing out here is, in 1973-74, it's as if you were drawing the diagram for a typical consumer. Okay? And let's say, to make life simple, that you have only two commodities, which we shall call food and non-food, respectively. Okay, let's keep things simple because I can't draw n-dimensional figures. I can only use the plane. Okay, let's say this is the highest indifference curve, which is attainable given the prices of the two commodities. Okay, and the relative prices are reflected by the slope of this. All right. Let me say that the food norm is directly specified as F star in terms of, say, calories, or once you converted the calories into corresponding food commodities. Let's say F star is the amount of food that I need in order to avoid poverty. Okay? So this diagram tells me that I need F star of food and N F star of non-food in the base year in order to avoid poverty. All right? Now, when I move on to another year, what I do is I multiply F star by the price of F in that year, and add that to NF star multiplied by the price of non-food in that year. And then I get my poverty line. Now, under what circumstances is this a reasonable thing to do? This would be a reasonable thing to do if relative prices continue to remain the same, and if the preferences also continue to remain the same. Then it wouldn't matter, okay? But how can you be sure? I mean, that's an empirical matter. That the relative prices are going to continue to remain the same, and the preferences are going to continue to remain the same. What is indeed more plausible? You see, as development happens, it is entirely conceivable that people tend to start preferring non-food items more urgently than food items, okay? Which, in the language of this diagram, would suggest that the indifference curve tends to become steeper with time. Okay? Food becomes less substitutable for non-food over time. And why is that? This has something to do with what Amartya Sen is very fond of quoting from Adam Smith. When he talks about the set of basic capabilities which it is a person's freedom to enjoy, he talks of the ability to appear in public without shame. Okay? This was something which Smith spoke about at length with his famous so-called linen shirt example. Right? That what was considered to be a luxury in an earlier period was now no longer a luxury, that any common day laborer must be expected to be wearing a linen shirt. And indeed, this particular example was highlighted by a colleague of mine with whom I've done a great deal of work. His name is Jairaj, who recalls that in his village, when he was growing up, which was in the 1960s, when he was a kid, people used to turn up at church, the men folk, with just a lungi. Okay. But these days, when they appear in church, they have to wear creaseless trousers and shirts. Okay, they wouldn't be seen dead in a ditch with a lungi. It's not possible anymore. You see what happens if you were to fix your commodity requirement as that of a lungi, okay, over time. What you're not allowing for is the possibility that people might relatively prioritize a nice set of clothes more urgently over time than they did at a more primitive level of the evolution of the economy. Okay? And this must be expected particularly to happen when they have demonstration effects, when they're looking at the richer sections of society, diversifying their consumption and so on and so forth. In fact, I recently read a paper which I will make no bones about it, which quite disgusted me, you know, where there's a lot of fancy equation mongering and the use of a logarithmic utility function, apparently on the grounds that it works for the author, in which we have an explanation of why the poor don't save. You and I would have thought that the poor don't save because they don't even have enough to consume, okay, in order to be able to find something to put by. But his explanation is that they engage in wasteful expenditure. Okay? That they're so influenced by the kind of sari which the heroine in Saas Bhi Kavi Bahu Thi, I think is the name of that, yeah, was wearing, that the domestic help insisted on emulating that person, and it was because of these kinds of misguided, not to say sinful indulgences, that the poor were not able to save. Now that also has to do with noting that the shape of the indifference curve can change over time. But I think when we talk about the shape of the indifference curve changing over time, we should do it with a certain measure of responsibility. I mean, this is a hard sociological question. What is it really that determines relative priorities and how these priorities change over time? I think this cannot be simply attributed to some unexplained or autonomous whimsicalness on the part of the typical consumer. These are shaped by the way in which society itself evolves. And one of the paradoxes of development is the following. Now, as you go through time in a village, if you have a public health center where there was none before, then you have an incentive to spend on medicines in a period of illness, which you didn't have before, because you didn't have anything to spend it on. You didn't have a dispensary. Okay? If you have a free school, even though you're not paying for the school, to send your child to school, you might have to invest in footwear for the child, or you might have to invest in a satchel for her, or buy some books for her. Okay? So it's entirely conceivable that because these opportunities now exist, you start spending more on things like health and education, but without necessarily commensurate increases in your incomes, which will permit you to do that without strain. So it's possible that you're doing that by tightening your belt and eating a little less. It's conceivable. I'm not saying that you're doing it, but it's conceivable. Okay? So, the simple point I'm making is that unless the shape of the utility curve and the budget constraint, the relative prices are assumed to remain the same over time, this easy recourse to simply correcting the original poverty line in 1973-74 for price changes is likely to be highly misleading. I mean, in particular, what would happen, supposing the price of food rose faster than the price of non-food, then, since we're also familiar with Stochastic substitution effects, we know what's going to happen over time. People will tend to substitute more non-food for food. Okay? That commodity whose price rise is slower than the other one is the one that's going to be prioritized relatively more over time. Okay? So, or if, as I said, the preferences change in the direction of attaching more priority to non-food than to food, then again, or there could be a third reason. You see, commodities which were not marketed earlier, which were available as part of common property resources. The best example is that of firewood. Okay? So with increasing population pressure and with dwindling firewood resources, there's a tendency for these common property resources to disappear, and what was essentially available free, except for the time that you expended on picking up firewood, if these are now going to make their appearance in the market, okay, then of course, this budget constraint is going to change. Okay. What will happen to the budget constraint typically is it will develop a kink, because what was originally free is now going to be priced. So, changes in the budget constraint and changes in preferences are entirely plausible. They're so plausible that they're the rule rather than the exception. But when you assume that problem away, and then you proceed to simply revalue the original commodity bundle at current prices in order to get the poverty line, should it really be surprising that at the officially stipulated poverty lines, as you go through time, you started out with a norm of 2,400 kilocalories, fewer and fewer calories are actually found to be, on average, consumed at those official poverty lines. Okay? That's what you must expect to find. And this, in fact, is what has been described in the Indian literature as a calorie drift. Okay? The drift between the norm which you started out with and what you actually find over time. So there are two ways of putting it. To achieve the same calorific norm as before, you will probably need more income than the official poverty line stipulates. Or, you're going to stick with the official poverty line, you're going to be able to consume less calories than you started out with. So the norm which underlay the entire exercise to begin with, what Sanjay called the motivation, the underlying motivation, was in terms of anchoring the poverty line in a certain calorific norm. Okay? This was the norm, and what was empirical was the actual pattern of consumption expenditure. But this became transformed over time into a norm which was the actual pattern of consumption expenditure in 73-74, and the calorie norm be damned. Okay? That would fall when it would. All right. Therefore, where then have we, if we were to put our finger on, how much more time do I have? Okay. Okay. Okay, fine. So if we were to put our finger on what is possibly going wrong in this way of fixing the poverty line, we would probably say that the mistake arises in seeking invariance of the poverty standard in the space of commodity bundles, or when it comes to the World Bank in the space of real incomes. What you really ought to be concerned with, see, when you're talking about calories, you're actually only dealing with one component of a set of common human functionings, which may be considered to be of salience and of value to the individual. So supposing for purposes of argument that we construct a small list of very essential elementary human functionings which are required in order to escape deprivation. Okay. Let's say to be reasonably well nourished, to be in reasonably good health, to lead a reasonably long life, to have access to, say, drinking water, to have access to clean forms of energy, to be able to enjoy the benefits of sanitation and privacy when you're defecating, toilets, to have access to energy sources such as electricity. So let's make a list of 7 or 8 of these. And in principle, it is possible to find out how much income you need in order to be able to secure these functions. Of course, we are talking, as Sanjay was at some pains to point out, about income-dependent capabilities of functions. Because not all functionings are necessarily achievable with income. But as long as we're dealing with a money-metric paradigm, let's assume that the functions we are speaking of are amenable to being translated in terms of their monetary values, how much you need. So what do you do in a situation like that? You stipulate all these functionings, and what constitutes a list of approved functionings might itself change over time. Okay? And the corresponding commodity bundles might also change over time. Okay? And therefore, even in real terms, the total amount of money that you need in order to escape poverty, postulated as deprivation in functioning space, is also liable to change over time. So there is no sanctity, there is no particular sanctity which need be, or which indeed should be attached to keeping the commodity bundle fixed or to keeping the real income fixed. What it is much more plausible to do is to keep fixed, or to see in an absolute light your ability to perform certain functionings, which are essentially states of being and doing. The ability to be mobile, the ability not to be hungry, the ability to avoid sickness. Okay, these are states of being and doing, and it is in this space of functionings that you postulate the escape from deprivation in an absolute sense. But again, for the two reasons which Sanjay pointed out, these absolute requirements in the space of functionings are compatible with variations or relativities in the space of resources. This is for at least two reasons. One is because of what one might call interpersonal heterogeneities. A lactating mother will typically require more nutritional input than a woman who is not. Okay. So having a unique poverty line, and this is what all these methods aim at, having a unique poverty line, which is supposed to be a line which holds for all individuals in all circumstances, does serious disservice to the easily apprehended everyday fact of individual heterogeneities. A person who belongs to a marginalized caste will presumably require more resources in order to be able to achieve the same functionings as somebody who is well connected. Okay. So people vary in their non-income characteristics according to shape, size, color, caste, religious affiliation, a whole host of things. In other words, people can convert resources into functionings at variable rates. Okay. So if I give the same resource to you as a disabled person who is not able to move about when you need a wheelchair, obviously I'm not taking into account the fact that you need more income to be able to move from point A to point B than I do because I'm able-bodied. Right? So the moment we allow for interpersonal variations in the ability to convert resources into functionings, we are also we're throwing the door open to variations in resource space. So the requirement of constancy or of invariance in resource space is no longer as attractive or plausible as it seemed to be on the surface of it. Okay. Indeed, if you read the 1993 expert group's requirement, it is stated as a self-evident axiom that comparability is going to be seriously jeopardized if you're going to vary the commodity quantity. And it has a certain plausible ring to it, the assertiveness with which it is stated, but on deeper examination we find that it makes sense to postulate the required invariance not in the space of resources, but in the space of capabilities and functionings. And once you've allowed for that, then you're throwing the door open to variations in resource space. There can also be the second reason apart from interpersonal variations, is because of contextual variations. A very simple example. People living in cold countries need more clothing to protect themselves from the inclemencies of the weather than people living in hot countries. Again, people living in hill areas need different orders of construction materials for their shelters than people who are living on the plains. Okay, so if you're going to, so what you ought to be doing, if you take sense injunction seriously to heart, namely that deprivation is best postulated absolutistically in the space of functionings and therefore relativistically in the space of resources, what you ought to be doing conceptually is to have a separate poverty line for each individual. Because each of us is different from the other. Okay? I mean, the mountain heaved and out came a rat, which is one poverty line. So for 1.2 billion, poverty line doesn't seem like a particularly feasible proposition. But I'll come back to that point in a little while and simply try and make what I'm saying as clear as I possibly can. And I'll probably require you to indulge me a bit by pretending that you go along with what I say. You see, this little exercise is slightly unfairly loaded against myself because I can bet my bottom dollar that many of you, including eminent ones in that lot, people like Sherlock's, with whom I've worked, or Deaton and so on, would actually, if these questions were presented at different points of time, with a gap which is long enough not to allow memory any role to play in the matter, they would acquiesce. So just humor me. Okay. I'm going to present to you two axioms, okay, on identification. And ask you to tell me whether you find them appealing or not. Okay. Axiom 1 says the following. The poverty line is the amount of income required at any time in order to achieve a set of basic human functionings. Would you agree with that? Yeah? Which strikes me as being unexceptionable. Okay. Silence, according to the law, connotes consent.
Yes.
Yes.
I take it you're saying yes already. Okay, this is my second axiom. It says, if a person is non-poor in time t1, okay, and her real income increases in time t2, then she should be deemed, oh, I find that from being unintelligible, I'm just becoming illegible. No? It's okay? Okay. Then she should be deemed, deemed to be non-poor in time t2. So what do I mean by real income? Think of it in a very strong fashion, a complete outward curve.
Just repeat the thing for them.
Yeah. What I've said here is, if a person is non-poor in some time period t1, and her real income increases in another time period t2, vis-a-vis what it was in t1, then she should continue to be deemed to be non-poor in time t2. Okay, so I'm non-poor today. Okay, my real income actually increases tomorrow. And if I'm non-poor today, then I put it to you that it's only logical that you should treat me as being non-poor tomorrow also. Would you agree with that?
No.
Why? To disappoint me strangely. Why is that?
Because of demonstration effect. I mean, what relatively you might want to consume things in time too, which, or in the sense that what is considered to be poor in time two might be different from what is considered to be poor in time one.
Excellent. That's right. Excellent. But you see, this is why this is unfair. If I had presented you with this today, okay, and presented you with this axiom 3 weeks from now, you would have said yes to both. In fact, there are many people who don't recognize that they're actually saying yes to both of these propositions. Now, you are one of those who say no to proposition 2, right? You say, no, I don't buy it. But is that true for everybody?
Yeah.
Now that you go with you.
Okay, let's have a simple example which will basically demonstrate the content of my friend's nihilism here when he says no. Okay. Supposing, let's just suppose that there are just two commodities which are required in order to achieve the functionings that are necessary to escape deprivation. And the only two functionings we should consider are nutritional adequacy and clothing. Okay. So supposing in some time period T1, you need, let's say, 5 kilograms of rice. So we're just talking about two commodities and 2 yards of cloth. Okay. This is what you require. Let's say that the prices of these commodities are rupees 2 per kilogram and rupees 5 per yard. Okay. Then to avoid poverty, you need 5 times 2, 10, plus 2 times 5, which is 10, which is 20. So 20 rupees is what you need to avoid poverty. Okay. Now consider another period of time, a second period of time, in which, let's say, the nature of work has become less manual. Okay, so you only need 4 kilograms of rice. But you need, let us say, like my friend Jairaj was mentioning, more clothing in order to avoid appearing in public without shame. Let's say you need 3 yards of cloth. To keep matters simple, I shall assume that there are no variations in prices. So I'm dealing with real incomes everywhere. Okay. So if price remains the same, then the total amount that you need to expend on rice is 2 times 4, which is 8 rupees. And what you need to expend on clothing is 5 times 3, which is 15. So the total amount that you need is 23 rupees. Right? Is that clear? Okay. Now consider a person who has an income of 21 rupees in the initial time period and an income of 22 in the second time period. Okay. Now, by axiom 1, a person is poor if she fails to have the income which is required in order to achieve a set of elementary human functionings. But she does have enough. She has more than she requires. She needs only 20, she has 21, so this person is non-poor in period 1. Okay. Now, by axiom 2, she was non-poor in period 1, her real income has actually increased, so she must be considered to be non-poor in period 2, right? But her income falls short of the poverty line in period 2, which is 23 rupees. So you get the contradictory result that this person is simultaneously both poor and non-poor in period 2. Okay. And why has this happened? It's happened because you have conflated the requirement of invariance into disparate spaces. Okay. On the one hand, this says that what you need to preserve is invariance in the space of functionings. This says what you need to do is to preserve invariance in the space of real incomes. And the two can contradict each other. Now, that this elementary mistake is done by many people of the greatest distinction is captured in what is often presented as an unambiguous test of a decline in poverty. Okay. What is that test? When people say that I'm say at time period T1, I have a certain distribution of incomes. What is the distribution of income? It's what is called a cumulative density function. If I have income X here I plot the cumulative proportion of the population with incomes not exceeding X. So the ceiling is 1.0 because 100% of the population are going to have income less than infinity, right? And as my income keeps increasing, the cumulative proportion of the population is going to keep increasing. Is that clear? This is what is called a simple cumulative distribution function. All right? Now, it's been pointed out that one distribution might display greater poverty for some poverty line Z1 in period 1, but then at a different poverty line Z2, okay, the second distribution might display more more poverty than the first distribution. Okay. So under what circumstances can you say, without any doubt at all, completely unambiguously, okay, this is what are called quasi-orders. Under what circumstances can you say, without any ambiguity, that one poverty regime has less poverty than the other? It will happen, so it is maintained, if this is the distribution function in period 1 and this is the distribution function in period 2, then no matter what poverty line you choose, in terms of the headcount ratio, the proportion of the population in poverty under distribution 2 is always less than the proportion of the population under distribution 1. So take any poverty line. Okay, under distribution 1, this is the headcount ratio. Under distribution 2, however, the headcount ratio is much smaller. And this is true no matter which poverty line you choose as being the relevant one. You're going to get the same result here too. Do you see that? So this is called, this phenomenon of one distribution function lying everywhere below another, with some liberties, it's called first order stochastic dominance. Stochastic, when you're talking about stochasticity, you're talking about some probability distribution, one certainty. Okay, so when this probability distribution lies everywhere below the other one, then you have a case of what is called first order stochastic dominance. And it is now an accepted part of the literature on poverty measurement that first order stochastic dominance is a sufficient guarantor for the proposition that poverty has unambiguously declined. So, which is why you will often find, even in the Indian context, where people say if you compare the 1973-74 or even more recently the 1993-94 cumulative distribution function with the 2009-10 distribution function, since the one lies everywhere below the other, it doesn't matter what poverty line you choose. Whatever poverty line you might choose, you're going to have to come up with a judgment that there is less poverty in the latter year than in the former. But what effectively is driving this result? The presumption that for you to be able to make a valid comparison of poverty across these two regimes, you must have the same poverty line. Right? That's my axiom too. It says as long as a person's real income has increased, okay, if I was originally non-poor, then I must continue to remain non-poor. That is an implication which falls out of a reliance on first order stochastic dominance. Okay. And I'm in a position to tell you that when I brought this up with Shorrocks, who is an extremely rude person and a very good friend of mine, he said, I don't have the time for your bullshit. So, but he had to make the time eventually. Because you can have a situation in which the poverty line in period 1 is Z1, 20 rupees, in period 2 it's 23 rupees. Okay? This is Z2. And what's happening? The headcount ratio in period 2 is higher than the headcount ratio in period 1. Even though the period 2 cumulative distribution function first order stochastically dominates the period 1. Okay. Let me take you back to something which Sanjay said. He talked about how extant protocols of poverty measurement or poverty assessment are shot through with confusions and embarrassments. This is one of them. Okay. This is a direct consequence of, when somebody like Sen advances a capability view of freedom, it's hard to resist the logic of that. So you go along with it, okay? But at the same time, through the back door, you also wish to place reliance on an axiom such as axiom 2. Now, what might account for this? Why this schizophrenia? And I think it has to do, ultimately, and this is a matter on which perhaps I have a small, I've not made up my mind on this, but it's possible that I might have a small disagreement with Sanjay, which is the following. You see, the conceptually kosher way of dealing with poverty, as I hope I've persuaded you into accepting, is to seek invariance of the poverty norm in the space of functions. Okay. Now let's say that in the limit, if you wanted to be really true to that, to the spirit of that enterprise, then you would have to have a different poverty line for each person in this country. That's not feasible. So let's be realistic and let's at least talk about demographic groups which are spatially differentiated. So let's say one poverty line for each district. Because if you don't have the necessary degree of heterogeneity in your poverty lines, then you're doing violence to the entire spirit which has animated your original critique of extant protocols of assessment. So you must have at least some measure of heterogeneity in the poverty lines that you choose, right? So let's say now there are upwards of 600 districts in the Indian UP. So you're going to have 600 poverty lines. That's not easy. Certainly not the way the Planning Commission is constituted. This is not being recorded, right? No, it wouldn't matter even if it were. I mean, when you have this utter shamelessness of the affidavit which was filed in the Supreme Court in response to a query by the court on what the poverty lines. I mean, they simply updated the 2004-05 poverty line by using the CPIAL for the rural areas, the CPIAW for the urban areas, and then presented the Supreme Court with those estimates, and then proceeded to defend these in very affected Cambridge accents, which was their undoing. I mean, if they just kept a low profile on that, it might have helped. But eventually they were caught out. Okay? And now, I don't want to get into the Tendulkar committee report. I might say one or two things about it, because it's hard to conceive that was even more absurd than what happened before. It was supposed to be a cure for the 1993 expert group. I've lost myself in my abuse. What was I saying? Yes. I was saying if you want to be conceptually kosher, then you might end up dealing with something which is not readily feasible. Coming up with a multiplicity of poverty lines to capture interpersonal and intercontextual variations in the ability to convert resources into functions. It may simply not be easy. Now, I'm perhaps exaggerating the problem. Sanjay would say that there is a case for having a permanent monitoring and tracking agency, say as a part of the Planning Commission, which does this job every once in 5 years, because it is useful. I mean, we can't collect information, you can't make an omelette without breaking an egg, so you would need to invest in those resources in order to have some kind of reasonable idea of. But failing that, what people have tended to do is, since what is right is so difficult to achieve, let me do something which it is relatively easy to achieve, even if it is wrong. Okay. Hence, it's relatively easy to think of one single poverty line which will do service for the entire nation. Okay. That's a relatively easy thing to do. Okay. You don't have a feasibility problem. Now, having done what is easy to do, when somebody points out that that's not the right thing to do, you feel called upon then to manufacture reasons for defending that position. Indeed, I mean, when it comes to dissembling, it's almost pathetic. I have the greatest respect, I believe, for the intellectual caliber of a person such as Martin Gavalian, who heads the World Bank's research division that has been putting out these poverty estimates. But he has been coming up with absolutely ludicrous arguments, intellectually completely discredited arguments to support the procedure which the World Bank uses. And increasingly, and of late, the nature of the defense has turned to targeting people, abusing them, of holding them guilty of political motivation. As if it were wrong to be political, but in a certain environment it is a sin to be political, and he exploits that. So you see, this is a matter of some importance, and this is where the problem arises. What is right is not generally easily achieved. There's a problem of feasibility. Okay? But what is feasible is commonly wrong. And this is why I often feel that the entire approach to the measurement of poverty, which consists of this two-part exercise of identification and aggregation, is actually on the ground something of an abortion. Okay? I can say that now because I'm going to retire in a year's time, so I'm no longer going to be completely dependent for my livelihood on this. But the fact remains, I believe, that this entire enterprise, and indeed the problem is confirmed. I've not gotten into the aggregation issue at all. When you get into aggregation, then many of the axioms which are routinely taken for granted, with a little bit of tweaking here and there, you find that they often result in impossibility results. Okay, where you get absurd outcomes by combining seemingly individually plausible axioms and seeing what is the kind of poverty index which they will lead to. And usually the quest terminates in a discovery of non-existence. Okay. So the aggregation problem is complicated enough, but at a much more basic level, the identification problem is also beset with such serious conceptual problems that if you wish to rectify them, okay, simple though that exercise might be in terms of the abstract requirement of seeking invariance in the space of functionings rather than in any other space, the actual mechanics of translating that into implementable sets of poverty lines may be a tall order. So people tend to go back to this procedure of specifying unique money-metric poverty lines, which in a precise technical sense of that word are meaningless. Because it's not clear any longer what you're measuring. It's measuring the length of this table with a unit of length called a remote, which then keeps varying when you measure its breadth. That's what they're doing. Okay, so I mean, I'm not using this as a hyperbole. I'm using this in a strictly technical sense. Much of extent poverty measurement, as we know it, I mean, whether you're talking of the federal government in the US or the official government of India procedure or the World Bank procedure, these are all completely substantively meaningless. They're also, as it happens, misleading. They're also, as it happens, cumulative lies. Okay. So, in the end, we really have no clear conception of what's happening on the poverty front on the basis of these kinds of exercises. But even casual empiricism will, I think, convince you that it's perhaps true that money-metric poverty has declined, okay, but nowhere near those dramatic rates which are so pleasingly featured on the graphs which the Planning Commission gives us. So if somebody says that poverty has actually increased over time, then I'd find that a little absurd. And this is also part of the reason why Sanjay has problems with Utsa Patnaik. Although she sees what the problem is, her remedy is not the right one. We'll just take one quick look at the remedy, and then I'll be done. And I won't, unless you want me to talk about the Tendulkar report, which I doubt that you do, because
I'm not so sure. I'm sure
okay, we'll see how it goes, because I'll deal with that very swiftly. You see, the absurd feature of the original 1993 way of fixing the poverty line was to take the pattern of consumption expenditure which obtained in 1973-74 as being sacred. Okay. But why should you privilege the particular pattern of consumption expenditure which obtained in 1973-74 over the consumption expenditure patterns which obtained in any other year? And there's no answer to that question. Effectively and implicitly, what the government is telling you is that there is something special and normatively significant about the way in which consumers behaved in 1973-74, which makes it appropriate for the government to employ that particular commodity bundle corresponding to 2,400 kilocalories as being the appropriate one for all time to come. Now, since that is easily questioned, one can have variations on this theme. Okay. Instead of using 1973-74 as the reference year, why not use 1990 as the reference year? Why not use the terminal year as the reference year? We are now in 2009-10, use the pattern of consumption expenditure which obtains today as the reference year, and then go backwards in time to compute the poverty rates for the other years by simply adjusting for price changes. Okay, if you can do the one, you can do the other. If you can do the other, you can do the third. Sometimes it's been suggested by a person of such eminence that his anonymity must be carefully concealed, so I won't tell you who it is. In the spirit of fairly magnanimous concession, अच्छा 10 साल में एक बार करा दो change. Okay. Change the reference here once every 10 years. Okay. And then there is the Utsa-Patnaik technique, which says, why not use each year as a reference year? Okay. Use each particular NSS or round as a reference year. Now, under certain very plausible circumstances, it can be demonstrated theoretically, and this is what in fact turns out to be the case empirically, that if you use 1973-74 as the base year, and you plot the poverty rates, the headcount ratio against time, you get this nice picture. Then for the first 10 years, you'll get poverty declining, shooting up again, coming down, shooting up again. So disaster for the government is going to come to power that year, contested elections. Okay. If, on the other hand, you do what Utsa-Patnaik does, which is to choose every year as a reference year, and for the reasons which I pointed out, because if over time, the relative price of food is increasing faster than that of non-food, if preferences are changing in favor of non-food over food, then the actual pattern that you get is like that. Poverties actually seem to be going up. Now, of course, there is one profound philosophical principle in terms of which Utsa-Patnaik should be allowed, per se, in the matter, which is that what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If she's saying, for purely polemical reasons, if you can do this, then I can do that, or that, or that, or that. I should be free to do any of these things. If you have a problem with my doing this, then you ought to have a problem with doing this. And she can always turn around and say, you started it. So, for rhetorical reasons, for polemical reasons, I think this is an extremely good device to employ to show up the absurdity of taking an entirely and completely inductive approach to what is essentially a normative problem. This is a point which has been very well made by Sanjay in a review article which he wrote on a book edited by Deaton and Cozell of the World Bank. It was called The Great Indian Poverty Debate, which didn't deal with this debate at all. It talked about everything else under the sun, about recall periods, about price indices, and so on and so forth. It didn't deal with this issue at all. So, in fact, I had suggested to Sanjay that we ought to have a companion book to that called The Great Indian Poverty Rebate, where he just discounted wholesale by employing these dubious methods. You know? So you see, as I was saying, any reasonably committed citizen of this country would find this picture, really as unbelievable as this one. Okay. Because ultimately they are all grounded in the same misconception, of deriving an odd proposition entirely from an is proposition, of being inductive in a wholesale and somewhat Philistine way, I mean, that's all I can say. So the only alternative to this really, in my reckoning, and also as I gather in Sanjay's, and this is in fact what is also advocated in his famous paper with Thomas Pocket, is to take a capability of functioning based approach, to seek invariance of the poverty standard in the space of functionings so that you get some idea of what's actually happening to poverty. So if you allow for that, then my view of the matter is, I mean, this is simply a hunch, is that you might get a trend which goes something like this. I don't even know if it will be significant, but you will. Because we know, I mean, once we correct for expectations and for contemporary standards in some fashion, as you must do in order to accommodate this capability of being able to appear in public without shame, well, what can we say about the poverty status of our country just by casual inspection? It's a rotten model shame. There's just too much of it around. So to seek to address that problem by telling those kinds of lies is utterly unprincipled. And the least that we can do as professionals and students as we go along is to call the bluff and to read the lie. Therefore, stop now, unless you have questions to ask or you want to know something about the Tendulkar report and so on.
Yeah,
what
question.
is
So what we've done that's worked reasonably well is supposed to take a slate and then respond to it, but or we can do one by one, whichever you prefer.
One by one?
One by one. Okay, so we will use the mic now, and we can have responses. So questions? Okay, what we go first to
The most marginalized classes, either in urban or rural areas, are not really buying food from the market, but are getting their food. Either it could be peasants working in a land and getting a part of the food, or it could be domestic help in urban homes who get food and a place to live. Now, the cost to them at which they're getting this is strictly determined not by market forces, but a lot by political bargaining power. So in a case like this, using a consumer price index might be completely different from the cost it is actually to the most marginalized class getting food. Is that also a certain problem with using the consumer price index for a poverty line?
No, it's just this. I mean, this is a problem which has been raised earlier as well. Okay? When you're looking at the LSSO surveys, when payment is made in kind rather than in cash, and in kind usually means in terms of food. Commonly encountered problems in economics. And, there are procedures which are available for dealing with this. They will be summarized in terms of imputation.
Hi sir, I'm Tarun Arora from ISEC.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking aloud, when you said that we have two different calorie norms for rural and urban areas, keeping in mind the difference in the nature of activity of the people residing there. So is it rational to have a different poverty lines for male and female?
Is it rational to
have a different poverty lines for male as well as female?
For male as well as female? I would think. I see no reason why not at all. I mean, I think you ought to have a different poverty line than I do, unless for accidental reasons we happen to be identical in all our non-income characteristics. As long as there are non-income characteristics of ours which are at variance with each other and which can be expected to influence the outcome of our poverty status, then those would have to be taken.
Yeah, I would like to extend on this part. Because, first of all, we consider that while estimating the poverty line, we will have to consider different things there while identification we do. So in that case, we can just separate the two. But when we talk about estimation purely, all I was thinking was that when we are suggesting these individual poverty lines, what we can do is that we can make certain demographic groups which also take care of the region-wise and some, like, it will be a lot of groups, and then we calculate some kind of poverty line, and then we aggregate it. That is what you were trying to put forward. But how would that aggregation actually take place?
Meaning just this. Okay. Let's say the world consists of only two people, you and me. Okay, and let's say that you require. You're a very efficient machine for converting resources into income. You require 20 rupees to escape poverty, and I require 80. Okay. Let's say your income is 15 and my income is 15. So how do I aggregate? What is the headcount ratio? I'm sorry, yours. Sorry. How do I aggregate? I'm poor, right? You're not poor. So 50% of the population is poor. So run the aggregation. Right? I don't have to worry about things like, remember what Sanjay said, once you do this, you don't have to worry about things like price indices and so on. At each particular point of time, you just draw this list of functions, cost them, add up the costs, and say, at prevailing prices, this is what I need in order to avoid poverty. Then, for each person I ask, does this person have an income in excess of or in deficit of her poverty line? If it's deficit, then you do what you do. So all of that.
Okay, let's go to Anita.
Taking off from what you just said, at each point in time, make a list of functionings for each person and say, this is the poverty line this time, that is in another line. Even if I comparing across, only the type-wise comparison, forget about the cross-use differences or anything. How is this comparison of functioning between time 1 and time 2? How is this different from preparing time 40 lines every year, like it says?
How different from?
From preparing 40 lines commodity bundles every year, what you just showed that Utsa is doing. How is that different from comparing your capabilities or your functionings every year? Am I making sense?
No, Utsa Patnaik is doing something completely different. What she's doing is, she's also using, you see, if you recall, the procedure which was employed by the Planning Commission in 1973-74 was the following. They had a plot of calories and consumption expenditure, and they specified a norm, and they found out what the corresponding poverty line was, and simply updated this poverty line. So what Utsa Patnaik is doing is to say, let's repeat this exercise each year. So I'm going to get a curve like that the next year, then this becomes my poverty line. If I'm going to get a curve like that the next year, then this becomes the poverty. So she also deals with only one poverty line at any given point of time for the entire nation. At any given point of time, Utsa has only one poverty line.
Yes, I
That's, whereas what I'm talking about is a plurality of poverty lines to accommodate interpersonal variations in the ability to convert resources into functions. Is it two completely different things?
I think I didn't make myself
No,
I'm taking the interpersonal dimension completely out of the picture.
Okay.
Supposing we say we can average in some way, it is a
So let's just assume we are dealing with homogeneous population.
Okay, we are dealing with homogeneous.
Okay.
Now, what you said is we should have the same capability. This population should have the same functionings in time 1 and time 2, then they are non-homogeneous. Yes?
Yes.
Now, that functioning can also be defined in terms of calories.
Yes, it can.
So, what is wrong with, or what is the difference between the two? Saying that the calorie consumption should remain the same.
The difference between the two is the following. Let us assume, let's simplify matters completely, okay? So that I go along with everything that you say. Let's say that the only functioning which matters is to be able to escape nutritional inadequacy. Let us furthermore say that you can state with a fair measure of confidence that if a person receives 2,400 kilocalories of food per day, then she's escaped nutritional inadequacy. Okay. And let's assume the same norm applies to each person. Okay. Then, what you need to do is to find out what is the least cost, subject to certain palatability constraints and so on, of achieving those 2,400 kilocalories. Okay. So you're translating those 2,400 kilocalories by using certain judgments. Recall what Sanjay said, by using certain judgments or what constitutes a reasonable food basket, okay, to achieve that 2,400 kilocalories. That's not what Utsa is doing. She's just looking at the actual, she's performing a completely inductive exercise. She's saying, in India, on average, I find that the norm of 2,400 kilocalories is being observed to be achieved at this consumption level. Now, that is a matter of what is. Unless you have a further rationalizable justification for asserting that what is also what ought to be, what is unconvinced?
There's one question back there.
All of the attempt to measure the poverty and to make the poverty line is concentrating on the individual, be it consumption or income. So I have the doubt why it can't be conceptualized poverty as a household, at a level of household, and since individual measurement might not be taking the what we call dependent, like a child will not have income. When you measure his poverty line, it doesn't mean like. And since you mentioned the Adam Smith and name of Adam Smith and his conception of. Since Amartya Sen picked up his idea of poverty from in terms of incapability, but he has been talking always in terms of subsistence, and subsistence broadly has been defined in terms of subsistence as the idea has been taking care of this dependent and their what you call their maintenance as well, mostly.
What the question was?
Question was how to conceptualize poverty in terms of household level.
Yes. You also said something about Amartya Sen and subsistence.
That was the concept in which they have Adam Smith was conceptualizing poverty. It was in terms of subsistence.
Okay, but it wasn't as it happens. Let me answer the latter question first. See, what one is trying to do here is to get rid of certain nuances and complexities in order simply so that one might concentrate on essential aspects of the problem. Now, if you read Townsend, for instance, he says that the approach to identification can be of three varieties. One is what he calls a subsistence approach, which is what you mentioned, where you're simply talking about the ability of an individual at an isolated level to be able to subsist. The second is an approach which takes account also of entire groups of people, and it talks about the availability to them of various amenities and infrastructures. And the third is what he calls a relative deprivation approach, which takes also into account not purely physical or physiological needs, but also takes into account mental affects which are triggered by notions of relative deprivation through comparisons with other people, and therefore that includes the notion of social exclusion. So you can have, your notion of who constitutes a set of poor people is going to become more and more expansive as you move from the subsistence to the collective to the relative deprivation approach. And I have no quarrels with that. But whichever approach you might choose, ultimately if the object is to be still able to identify the poor by reference to some monometric line, then all of these issues that I spoke about would come to the fore. And they are not exclusive to any one particular way of approaching the issue. Now, as for households, yes. I have simplified grossly, okay, I have taken the income recipient unit to be the individual. But very often it makes sense to treat the household as the income recipient. If you treat the household as income recipient, then you are also allowing for one extremely major complication, which is that of heterogeneity. One of the most heterogeneous entities you can think of is a household. As you know, households are variable in terms of age and sex composition, and also in terms of household size. Again, there are such things as economies of scale. So it was precisely the heterogeneity among households which led to the requirement that when you were dealing with poverty identification at the household level and its aggregation, you would have to treat these households as comparable one with the other. Which means that you would have to have the notion of a standard household in terms of which you would recalibrate the other households to account for their variations in size and age and gender composition. This results in an exercise called identifying equivalence scales, the equivalization of households. It opens up a can of worms, as it happens, because one of the most notoriously difficult issues to handle in welfare distribution and analysis is that of equivalence scales. And you find that there are fundamental conflicts between, once you start seeking to equivalize, between notions of equality and symmetry or analogy. These are things which I won't go into now, but these are interesting avenues for further discussion.
But even then you have problem with how do you measure the poverty line for a child?
I submit all of it. What I'm saying is that it's harder, not easier. It's a good deal harder.
Next question. Sashwata and then.
Sir, can you give some example of this functioning that you mentioned about some functions are like yards, right? That these are the things that somebody needs to
What Sen says is that he would find it difficult to prescribe a list of desired functionings once and for all. He says that what is the list of functionings which will acquire salience at any given point of time is highly context dependent and is best evolved through public discussion, through democratic reasoning, and so on and so forth. But what he does is to give you some illustrative examples. If you're talking about extremely basic functionings, okay, then the ability to escape hunger, the ability to escape ignorance, that is to be reasonably literate, the ability to be in reasonably good health, the ability to be mobile, the ability not to be systematically disadvantaged in the event of acts of God, like droughts and floods and so on.
There, I just want to clarify my doubt.
Yeah.
I do have a sense that when we talk about people being poor, or when we think about the poor people and all, we think that okay, if they do have some basic needs, then they are not poor. I just wonder that if there is a part of country which is shining, why not the basic need also should shine? And I do have a sense that people do not do that. That when you think about the poor, it's just you can eat, you can wear clothes, you can go somewhere, that's it. Don't think about anything else. But I have changed my mobile in the last 2 years 2-3 times. So but then I do that. This discourse of poverty take care of that. That's fine.
Well, I think what you say has significant implications for the way in which poverty lines have been sort of drawn by the World Bank. What Rebellion says, for example, is that this $1 a day eventually emerged over 3 or 4 successive iterations using different combinations of countries and slightly different procedures. In one case it was the mean, in one case it was the median, in another case it was the performance of the 10 poorest countries. What they did was to employ effectively the poverty lines of the poorest countries in the world. Okay? And they said that our understanding of poverty ought to be mediated by how poverty is understood by the poorest countries in the world. Very often, as Sanjay and Thomas have pointed out, these poverty lines were specified by the World Bank itself for these countries. But the larger question which you raise is, there are 2 types of errors one can make in identification. You can make the error of counting a poor person as being non-poor. I think that's a serious error. Or you can count a non-poor person as being poor, which I would say is less grave. If you must make a mistake, I would rather make the latter mistake than the former. So if you're interested in avoiding a type 1 error, what you should really be doing is to take the poverty line of the richest countries, as you know. Okay. Now, in the US, for example, the poverty line at 2005 prices is of the order of about $13 US. Whereas for the rest of the world, you're saying $1 is fine. Now, I don't see that Martin Rebellion is going to address somebody in California who has got $2 a day, tell them, don't be hysterical, let me speak to you in terms of calm reasonableness and invite you to accept that you're not poor because you've got 100% more than $1 a day. So yes, I agree with you that depending upon which of these 2 kinds of errors that you're keener on avoiding, you would favor the max or the min for it.
Okay. May I actually take
the mic?
Yeah, the mic. I have not asked a question thus far in the workshop, so I'm going to try to actually ask one. So, in fact, what I'm going to do is sneak in. I'm going to ask 3 and 1 comment.
Okay.
So, but they'll be short. So the comment is actually, this is just it's not hyperbole. It's a fabulous presentation of real clarity and very clear, and I hope that one day I'll be able to give a talk of such clarity. And really, this is really something.
Okay, that's
awfully
nice.
That will be short. Okay. The 3 questions. The first question that I have is, has there been any attempt to actually do poverty line based on capabilities sort of approach, and if so, how closely does it correlate with when you try to find that, when you look at that, how does a real income measure correspond to that? Is there any correspondence at all? That's the first question. The second question that I have is, I'm not sure everybody knows about the Tendulkar committee report, so maybe a few words on that and the problems that are associated with that. And the third question that I have is, basically on the space of democratic decision making about what constitutes capabilities. Should we think of this as a national space, as a local space, as a global space? Just some questions.
This last question I disposed of by saying that that you do have some models like with the kinds of public sunwais which have been organized by people like Grace and non-Grace and Aruna Roy and others. So we are not wanting, and of course you do have a decentralized system of administration now through panchayats. So some sensible exploitation of these mechanisms. You remember several years ago, 25 years ago, maybe, I had a colleague who is now at the Indian Statistical Institute of Kolkata, V.K. Ramachandran, who said, why can't somebody just go out into their neighborhood and, just look at typically the kind of food which is say, prepared in the house of one's domestic cat, for example. Okay, so a form of korandu, sort of gravy, which has very little dal in it, but which will have some ingredients. So you need mirchi powder, you need some masala, you need some mustard seeds, okay, you need some oil. Okay. So do an intensive costing of elementary items of the dietary intake of people of a certain socio-economic class. It's not the most difficult of things to find out how much it's going to cost for you to stay in a one-room job, house. So think of some elementary requirements: shelter, clothing, education, books, footwear, And at the household level, you will certainly get, not with this kind of breathtaking accuracy, 49 rupees and 9 paisa, which you have on order of magnitude. As Marx once said, the socially necessary means of production are always practically known. We all know how much we need to avoid poverty. And I'd say we need at least 10,000 rupees a month for a household of 4. At least 10,000 rupees a month for a household of 4 in a city like Bangalore. At least to be able to give any kind of decent existence. And what is the poverty line that we actually have? 2,400 rupees for a household of 4. Something of that order. So the actual requirement is at least 3.5 times the thought as the. But it is worth doing, and as it happens, there's this very motivated young girl from Christ University whom I met last time I come here, and she's been very serious about wanting to do something. And this time when I came here, I said, I'm coming here. She came over and saw me yesterday, yesterday. And she is now undertaking to work out a poverty line for the slum in the area in which she lives in Mysore. So she said that'll be interesting. We'll try and get it published in the EPW. Technical question. Okay. Very quickly, okay, because I can see that you guys are getting tired. But so I'll deal with only one specific aspect of the technical committee report. It really is a sad report. It's sad when it's not funny. And I tell you why. See, what they've done is they say that the motivation for the Technical Committee report was the serious lapses of the 1993 expert. So they needed to rectify those lapses. And one of the things that they said they undertook was not to seek to anchor their poverty line in any sort of nutritional norm. Okay. And this is their claim. What they actually did was the following. You see, if you used the 1973-74 poverty lines put out by the 1993 expert group and updated these poverty lines using the official procedure of applying the consumer price indices relevant for rural and urban areas respectively, then you found that in the urban areas of the country, the headcount ratio was in the order of about 25%, whereas in the rural areas, it was of the order of about 28%. Okay. Now, the Technical Committee decided in its wisdom that this was a plausible number, but this was not. Okay, that this was much too low. Okay. And that, so as not to offend the sensibilities of people who were sniggering at this number, but who probably found this number not completely impossible. They said, let's take the poverty line to be the urban poverty line using the 1973-74 poverty line as a base here, updating that using the consumer price index for industrial workers. So we use the urban poverty line as the poverty line for the country as a whole. So what they proceeded to do was to find out the consumption bundle corresponding to that urban poverty line. And they said we shall now revalue this consumption bundle at current prices as we go through time, or revalue them according to state-specific prices on a cost-efficient basis. Now, they were careful to point out that their poverty line was not based in any nutritional anchoring. But it's not clear on what it is based. If anything, it is still based on the consumption expenditure corresponding to a nutritional norm of 2,100 kilocalories per person per day in 1973-74, updated to current prices. So even their claim that it is not really founded in a nutritional norm seems to me to be unsustainable. I can't make sense of that, because the line which they employ is the urban poverty line under the old system. Now, they also say that when they use this line, they find that in 2004-05, a nutritional norm of something of the order of 1,900 kilocalories or something like that was seen to be achieved, which they say conforms with the new ILO norms. Now, I think this is the case for these people to make up their minds. Either the nutritional norm matters in the scheme of things, or it doesn't. Okay? If it doesn't matter, then what's the point of bringing out this? Because that's purely fortuitous. It just so happened that they're taking advantage, advantageous advantage of some circumstantial detail, such as that at the poverty lines which they were putting out, the new norms according to the ILO were in fact being met. But what is ultimately most seriously problematic with their method is the following. You see, how do you actually, it's a two-stage process. Here you have consumption expenditure, here you have calories, and you have the relationship between calorie consumption and consumption expenditure. So you specify a norm, C star, which gives you an X star, which is the poverty line. This is what they did initially. Right? Then what you do is, this is X and this is f of X, which is a cumulative density function. Okay, remember? The cumulative proportion of the population with the incomes less than or equal to X, but every X is zero. This is cumulative density function. Okay. Now you take X star out here, which you got, and then you find out what is the proportion of the population. So this is the procedure which is generally adopted. Okay. You're all right. Looking very tolerant. Okay, fine. So the name of the game is to infer the headcount ratio from a normative poverty. Okay. What instead did the Tribunal Committee actually do? Okay. This was the urban, this was the rural, let's say. Okay. These were the extra rural and extra urban, which they derived from the old methodology. Okay. And they got 28% rural, 25% urban. Right? And they said, this number looks suspiciously small, this number looks okay. So they took this to be the poverty line. What have they actually done? I mean, people brought up in nice families are told to infer the headcount ratio from a normative poverty line, but they reduced the poverty line from what they thought was an acceptable headcount ratio. So, in fact, it's so absurd that there's a convoluted sentence which I don't quite remember in the might be able to tell you one thing. I might actually have it. It says, underlying the consumption poverty line is the reference poverty line basket of household goods and services consumed by those households at the borderline separating the poor from the non-poor. Do you make anything of this? I don't blame you, but I'll read it again slowly. They say, underlying the consumption poverty line is the reference poverty line basket of household goods and services consumed by those households at the borderline separating the poor from the non-poor. Now, what is the borderline separating the poor from the non-poor? What's a simpler word for that? Poverty line. It's a poverty line. So effectively they're saying underlying the consumption poverty line is the reference poverty line basket of household goods and services consumed by those households at the poverty line. Okay. So you need, presumably, the poverty line to determine the consumption basket, to determine the poverty line, to determine the consumption basket, to determine the poverty line in an endless circle. And they try themselves out into these circles simply because they didn't seem to have the energy to apply to the problem at hand. You know, and I also know something of the politics of this. I mean, this brainwave actually came from the left. There's an identifiable agent who's responsible for this. I'll tell you in private. Yeah.
There's actually one more question here before.
Okay.
So this is more of a clarificatory question. You mentioned the term calorie drift. So can you elaborate a little bit on that? And the second question is, on what terms do you differ from this Dieter and Rees on the poverty issues?
What's there to be said about calories? I think it is.
Calorie drift. What is a calorie drift?
Oh, what's a calorie drift? Okay. Calorie drift is, if you recall, in 1973-74, the poverty line was said to be that level of consumption expenditure required to achieve the calorific norm of 2,400 kilocalories. Now they simply updated that poverty line, and what was observed was that over time, at the official poverty lines, which were derived by simply updating the original poverty line by using an appropriate price index, at these poverty lines, systematically less and less calories were consumed over time. So there was a gap between the norm of 2,400 and the actual calorific consumption at the poverty lines, a gap which kept widening over time. Hence the term calorie drift. Clear now? The second question you asked also?
Differences
with Drees and Deaton. Well, Drees and Deaton used the official poverty lines. Drees and Deaton used the official poverty lines. And I did discuss this with John Drees in the early 2000s when he gave me an answer which was in fact addressed by the figures, which was addressed by Sanjay, who attributed to Deaton this quote. He said there's an element of arbitrariness with this, and he just dismissed it. Now, I think it's one thing to be arbitrary and another thing to be unreasonable. Okay. Now, if I say, I mean, let's split this up in half. This is a way of doing it. Somebody comes and says, why don't you give 0.49999 and you keep 0.011, whatever? Okay. Now, you see, that's being arbitrary. Very often one specifies some convenient whole number, okay, or an easy fraction to deal with, and it is arbitrary. There's nothing fundamentally unreasonable about advancing the claims of 1/2 over 0.49999. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is to take recourse to arbitrariness. Okay, and this is exactly what Sanjay was also pointing out, is to take an all or nothing view of the matter. Either purge yourself of every last symptom of arbitrariness or talk nonsense. You can't be that way. What you try to do is to mitigate the circumstances which attend your dealing with an essentially contested field. Try and be as reasonable as you can while not laying any claim to being utterly unexceptionable in what you say. So that's not the reason, since any poverty line must have some element of arbitrariness attached to it, to proceed to do this sort of thing.
One last question. If there's someone who's not asked a question and it's okay. So here, I think we can ask questions afterwards, I suppose.
Sir, I'm Shalini from JU, and mine is a more practical question. You said we want to revise multiple poverty lines. Now, I was wondering how to do that. Now, if we were to suppose we decide that we want multiple poverty lines in India, and for that we would need extra information, because if we want to revise poverty line for a particular district, not disaggregated at further levels. So for that particular district, we would need further survey, because we need to know what kind of basic capabilities we're looking at. So at a practical level, if we're moving away from one line towards multiple lines, we would need a lot of extra information. Can you elaborate on what kind of information?
Not thought seriously about it. You see, it's like collecting information on prices. You have designated price centers. Okay. So, I mean, again, it's probably arbitrary to talk about 4 centers within each district. You know, take 4 columns in each district to capture some kind of variety if there should exist such a variety in terms of climatic and other features, which may be of relevance. Okay. So, but essentially what one is saying is deal with a tractable number of centers within each district, so that you capture a certain element of the heterogeneity without committing yourself to heterogeneity across the board, and therefore making the problem
Can that particular thing be done using the existing analysis reports?
using what analysis?
Using the existing analysis reports, can something be done?
I don't know. I mean, one would have to look at the original schedules to see. But my suspicion is no. I think the idea which Sanjay has of having a permanent poverty monitoring and tracking agency is a very good one, and they might need to carry out a set of fresh surveys at a sufficiently developed.
Well, okay, we've run out of time, so please join me in thanking Professor Probably some other questions. Just give him 5 minutes at least to recover, and then we can have lunch together, which you can possibly ask.
Thank you very much.